As we make our way into the church, it's so great to see all of you. We had this naive idea that it would only take us a half an hour to have lunch together after having been so far apart for so many months, and now we know better. So it was just so wonderful to see everyone gathered outside and catching up as we all did. I'm just riffing here for a minute as the last few of us find our way in. So this is the kickoff program for Saints Alive for 2021 to 2022 after, well, it was an entire year last year that we did not meet in person, and we extended our program year right through the summer last year with webinars that were really wonderful and opened up our capacity to welcome guests from faraway places to speak to us about matters of interest. And now we are holding that new learning together with being able to be once again in this beautiful space. So we are live streaming this presentation, and I believe a recording will be available afterward via our YouTube and Facebook channels if you want to go back and look at it later or invite a friend to do that. And Missy's head is not going like this, so I think that what I just said is true. I think what I would like to do is just give a very brief prayer of thanks for our regathering today. So the Lord be with you. Let us pray. God, who is the source of love and life, we thank you for this community. We thank you for the opportunity to be in space together once again and to renew friendships, deep friendships, and to welcome new friends. We also thank you always for every opportunity to learn and grow in our understanding of this world in which we live and move and have our being. And that world includes history and art and science and technology and so many fascinating things. So thank you for this homecoming, for this program this year. Amen. And now I'm going to turn the microphone over to Weston Neff, who's a member of our program committee for Saints Alive, and he's going to introduce our wonderful speakers.
Well, just by way of a preamble, what I'm going to say right now is a spoiler because it's public knowledge. What I'm going to say has been published in a book by Jason Froelich. And I know that there are many Getty watchers sitting here today, and that... okay. Even though I know this story backwards and forwards, I still have to have a piece of paper, and I have to be able to read it. But so you will, those of you who are Getty watchers will remember that in 1988, the Getty bought a 7-foot-tall, 1,300-pound limestone and marble statue believed to be the goddess Aphrodite. And the price was $18 million. Of course, that wasn't in the newspapers immediately, but it soon came to be known. Okay, sorry. So in her presentation to the Acquisitions Committee, the curator told the assembled trustees and curators, me included, that it was the greatest piece of classical sculpture outside of Greece and Great Britain. And so this was a moment of great joy for the Getty to be able to acquire this piece. However, almost immediately, the provenance, and please note the word provenance, of the sculpture came to be called into question. The seller to the Getty claimed that the statue had remained with a Swiss family for 50 years before. That didn't strike everybody as a very plausible idea. However, photos uncovered almost 20 years later made it clear that the statue had been illegally excavated in Italy. So then in March of 2011, that's almost more than 20 years later, the statue was packed up and flown to Rome aboard an Alitalia cargo plane. And 2 years later, the Getty Provenance Research Project was initiated, with this group as among its founders. So the Getty curators with us today, David Saunders, Judith Barr, and Nicole Brudovich, will tell us how they use photographs and other evidence to uncover the provenance of antiquities in the Getty collection. So please welcome Judith, Nicole, and David.
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you, Weston, for the kind invitation for us all to present to you today. We're so excited to be here. But before we start off, we wanted to just describe what we're talking about when we say the word provenance. What do you know about provenance? What does it make you think about? Provenance is a word that gets at an object's history, particularly its past ownership. You might also hear terms like object biography or collecting history. These emphasize different aspects of an object's history and give context to its different lives in different ways. You might also be familiar with the term provenience. At the Getty, we use provenience to mean an object's find spot or its place of excavation, and you'll see this information on our collection pages where known. Different places use these terms interchangeably, and so we just wanted to clarify the way we'll be using them today.
So, well, hopefully you can all hear me. My microphone should be on.
Cool.
No, not at all. Not at all, people. I should be on. Yeah, I'm good. Okay. What we plan to do this afternoon is talk for about half an hour, and then we'd be happy to take questions. What we'll do is outline some of the methods and approaches that we've been using over the last few years to research the history of our collection, and show you a number of case studies, individual objects that have fascinating stories. And they are not all as monumental as the Aphrodite that Weston mentioned, but what we hope to show you is there is an enormous amount of information to derive from each and every object in our collection. By way of a bit of background, this is a project that began in 2012, and what you see on the screen is a web page referring to the Online Scholarly Catalogue Initiative. And this is part of a broader Getty endeavor from the very highest level to make our collection more accessible, more easy to search, to provide more and more information to our visitors, both in the galleries and online. And so we've been undertaking across the museum, including the Department of Photographs, a whole-scale cataloging project, describing objects, photographing them, ensuring those photographs are available online at getty.edu for you to be able to download and use for whatever purpose you wish, really fleshing out the information we present to our audiences. And for the Antiquities Department, in light, as Weston mentioned, in light of the scrutiny that the collection had received, the returns to Italy and to Greece in 2007, we all recognize that the provenance, the ownership history of our collection of every object in it was a priority. So that was where we first sort of wanted to target our energies. And I was sort of asked to oversee this project. We initially hired a curatorial assistant to work devotedly on this. And then in 2015, Judith and Nicole came on board. And without wishing to embarrass them, they have transformed really the way that we understand and think about our collection, the way we talk about it, what we understand about it, what we can know, and have really been pioneers in shaping, the research and engagement with our objects. This is no small task. If you go to our collection pages, and this is on getty.edu, all of our objects are searchable, as you see here. If you search for the Antiquities collection, we have about 46,000 things. That was the correct noise, thank you. It's a somewhat deceptive number. Many hundreds, many thousands of these things are vase fragments, coins, mosaic, tesserae, tiny little things that all belong together So in some ways, that number is a little bit deceptive. If you come to the villa, you will see in the galleries maybe about 1,200 objects. So we have a lot in storage, but each and every one of these objects has to be documented and researched. And that is why this project has taken us the better part of a decade. By the end of 2019, we'd completed what we think of as a first pass of the whole collection. So today, when you go online, you can find all of the information that we've been able to verify about the ownership history of each and every object. And we show you here a mosaic, which you'll be seeing a little bit more of in the course of the afternoon. And this is really a best case scenario where we can trace, I can't see without my glasses, right back from when Mr. Getty had it. Previously it was with William Randolph Hearst, and right the way back to when it was first discovered in France. So this gives you the sort of whole modern history of this individual object. So as I say, what we'll do in what follows is present an outline of some of the methods and approaches we've taken to discovering this sort of information and show you some examples. Just before we do that, though, just to say a little bit more, and we can talk about this in the questions afterwards, but the field of provenance research, we've been doing this for 10 years or so, and in the museum world, that is not a long time. Museums evolve very slowly. But this particular aspect of research really has rapidly evolved, partly because of the efforts and endeavors to digitize collections, make things more accessible, not only for the objects themselves, but facilitating communication between different colleagues, different museums, and also the, I suppose, assessment and evaluation of provenance as a field. And when we started this project, there really wasn't a model for us working with the ancient Mediterranean collection. Back in sort of the 2012s, the sort of primary fields in which provenance was being done in museums was either related to World War II and Nazi-era looting, for which there is a lot of good documentation, but not necessarily directly relevant to our field, and also NAGPRA, the North American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which again allows for certain processes and procedures in relation to objects in museum collections. All of which is a long-winded way of saying that we really didn't have a set of protocols to follow, and over the course of the last few years, we've really been having to shape this project ourselves. And at this point, I should hand over to Judith and Nicole to talk about some of the ways in which we did that.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great, oh my goodness, too loud? Okay, a great introduction. So how did we undertake this project? And I'll just leave this slide on the screen to kind of give a sense both of the provenance tab, but there's also all these other fields, exhibitions, bibliography. It was very involved to research objects from all these different angles. And as David noted, our collection numbers over 46,000 individual records, but we were able to divide these into batches, and that's kind of how we first tackled this. Before our time, the curatorial assistant working on the project along with David first focused on objects on view, those 1,200 in the galleries, because those are the things the visitor would first see and would be perhaps looking up on our collection pages. And then we divided it into batches based on their acquisition, the donor or the dealer, or how it entered the collection. And last, in the most recent years, we looked at objects based on their year of acquisition. So the project evolved as we worked through, and also as we gained a deeper understanding of the resources available both at the Getty and digitized and other resources available more widely. And as David mentioned, this has resulted in what we've called a first pass, and we hope to keep adding to it and keep revisiting those earlier records that we investigated. And this is just a fun, so sometimes researching an object and putting all of its information online might just take an hour. It might be a pretty simple process. You check the files, check the references, easy to go. But sometimes it could take months or even years to figure out a problematic, or just a trail that you can't quite track. So to that end, we maintained a balance between simple and more complex research questions and tried to focus on information that we could really verify. That is, using internal documentation, publications, archives, photographs, to actually verify that provenance was accurate. And as I've said, and we've said, one of the problems of this is that this research is rarely, if ever, complete. And so to perhaps misquote Da Vinci, it's never finished, only abandoned. And so how did this actually work, and how did we get started? I'll turn it over to Judith.
So you can see a map here of some of the methods and resources that we use. One of our first ports of call are curatorial files, which we maintain for every object. These include original correspondences, invoices, notes from visiting scholars, publications, and research on objects. They also might contain old photos that can have important notations or inventory numbers. They can even show the object on view over decades, or even show it in different stages of, with different conservation treatments.
Next, we check our registrar file, which is, for those who are unfamiliar, the museum registrar is responsible for maintaining the official object records, whereas the curatorial files are more about interpretation and comparisons. These are the actual records for the museum, so they will have their acquisition paperwork, their loan, their condition, all stored there. And this also records like any movement, so often shipping paperwork that wouldn't be in our files might be preserved by the registrars, and they do an incredible job ensuring the objects are safe and stored carefully. Along with the registrar, Along with the registrar's files, we check conservation files, and now these at the Getty, and again, each museum operates differently, but at the Getty, these are stored separately, and the conservation department maintains files for objects they've worked on. Often treatments done sometimes pre-acquisition or as loans, or with photos documenting the process of treatments where maybe old numbers were removed, and these are very important for tracing a provenance.
So at the Getty, we also have an institutional archive, which a lot of institutions maintain in different forms. And it's here that we have documents relating to the Antiquities collection, particularly through the extensive documentation relating to J. Paul Getty's own art purchases. So we have lots of letters about the building of the villa, about him shipping artworks, even once he'd moved abroad. And he'd get lots of updates about the way objects were conserved and displayed, maintained. This is an invaluable record that we've only just dipped into, as these files can record commentary on objects that might not be recorded anywhere else.
And so what we've just covered are more of our internal records that are all housed in different places, but moving externally, we reference publications and auction catalogs. And these are things that are, fortunately for us, available on site at the villa or at the Getty Library. And one of the most valuable resources are the sale catalogs, especially when they're annotated, and include price lists or other information to track a provenance. Oh, and I should mention, when we can't find a reference, our interlibrary loan has been able to find obscure books and monographs for us, so very helpful. Oh, sorry, you mean by auction catalogs? Sorry, these are Sotheby's, Christie's historic auction catalogs that the Getty stores in their library, and that we reference to track whether, you'll see an example of this, but not Getty collection auctions. That is not a thing, yeah.
So more recently, too, we're fortunate to have access to digital archives. So this has been a huge boon, especially in the last 18 months, because it means that from your computer, anywhere in the world, you can access the entire holdings of a single dealer, like the stock books and letters of the Brummer Gallery, which is held by the Met in New York. There are also databases that make hundreds of thousands of historic photographs in private collections, museums, and dealers available. And beyond the evidence of the photographs themselves, these files sometimes include additional dates or notes that are unpublished elsewhere.
And last, but definitely not least, in some cases, when appropriate, we will reach out to colleagues at other museums and collections, archivists, and auction houses and dealers. And this is very much object-based. If a question comes up, we reach out. And this has proven very useful in specific cases. So this gives kind of the full spectrum of the many resources we use, starting with our internal paperwork, organizing it, and then looking outside and kind of assessing and building up a provenance. But of course.
But one of our most essential tools is, of course, at the heart of the museum, the objects themselves. Some of our more unusual provenance sources include wax seals, the handwriting of a marquess preserved on the bottom of a vase, and even centuries-old engraving carved into the stones themselves. We've now cataloged dozens of these kinds of ownership marks on objects in the collection, and we make those notes available online. One aspect of collaborating with our wonderful museum conservators has been collecting better documentation for this kind of evidence, which is often overlooked, as seen with this mummy portrait of a woman on the left. Painted in encaustic on a wooden panel, its reverse preserves a collection stamp from the framed Theodore Graff collection, dating to the beginning of the 20th century, a detail of which you can see on the middle, and you can see our conservators working on the right.
So now let's jump to some case studies. And starting where Judith left off, we'll explore how the objects themselves can sometimes tell their own stories. So in this case, it was where we had completely new information that was not recorded elsewhere was discovered. And a bit of background, in 1978, Malcolm Weiner donated these 4 bronze figurines to the Getty, but there was no given provenance with that donation. And I want to apologize for these unflattering storage photographs. They're actually wonderful little objects. They're solid cast bronze statuettes. They have a bit of weight and would easily fit in the palm of your hand. In antiquity, they likely served as votives in a sanctuary or in a funerary context. And just, if you can see, the figure on the far right is probably the most interesting. It's a priestess holding a offering bowl. So we had acquisition photos of these objects in the files, but they didn't show the whole object. They gave one perspective, and then we did have condition reports, but they made no mention of anything unusual about these objects. So as part of our due diligence, we checked the objects in storage to see if there was anything hiding or if there's anything more to discover. And upon reviewing them, we were surprised to find that in addition to the Getty's accession numbers, so every object in a museum has an accession number, and part of the registrar's job is to make sure they're on the object. So some of the numbers are not unusual, there are numbers, but in addition to those, there were these mysterious letters and numbers. And here I want to highlight this. Sorry, I'm trying to see around the screen. And I don't know if anyone can see that's kind of far on the screen, but what that might be. And that was probably a diagnostic monogram. And it actually is 2 letters combined. HF, if you can't make it out. And sure enough, with the HF monogram in hand, knowing that this was a collection of small votive bronzes, doing some searching, we were able to track this down to Hugh Fawcett. So let me see if I can get, yes. Dr. Hugh Alderson Fawcett, an antiquarian collector who was interested in the typologies of objects. He collected mainly bronze and stone from the Paleolithic to the early Saxon period. And the bulk of his collection was actually purchased by the Bristol Museum in 1980. And I discovered, hold additional documentation of his organization and records. So I reached out to their curator, a case of reaching out to collections or museums where appropriate. And Gail Boyle, she's very helpful. She actually has been responsible for their collection of Hugh Fawcett material since 1987, so she's the expert. And she gave these photos and additional images of his diaries documenting his record keeping. And using this, we were able to confirm indeed it was Hugh Fawcett's objects and kind of learn a little bit more about them. And she gave us important biographical information. For instance, he began collecting actively during World War I while serving abroad. He'd occasionally excavate in these limited excavations, but mostly bought things in rooms, curio shops, and from friends or workmen. And he continued to collect over the years, building up a collection, but also periodically selling objects off. And using this information, we started to look into sale catalogs, the ones that we have on our shelves, to see if there were any Hugh Fawcett mentioned in any catalogs. Sure enough, there were a group of catalogs from the 60s that aligned with our dates, because it had to be before 1978, that were antiquities, that could work. And in one of these, scanning through it, we found an entry that matched our group in their description. A small lot of bronzes of different figures. This was sold at Sotheby's in 1963. Even better, the back of the catalog had a price list. And this is where after the auction is complete, they put a price list saying who bought what and for what it went for. And this didn't happen in every catalog. It was there's an interesting history to that. But, and it turned out our lot was purchased by none other than Malcolm Weiner, the same collector who had donated the bronzes to the Getty in 1978. And so this kind of tidily brings everything together. Here we have, and it's rare that it's so tidy as this, that the person who donated them is the very person who bought them from the sale. But here you can see on the left before what the status of the provenance was, and with the little monogram, we were able to reconnect these objects with much of their history and potentially with other Hugh Fawcett collection objects. And yeah, and also new photography is forthcoming for the other guys. Now I'll turn it over to Judith.
So our next case study is this Etruscan terracotta cinerary urn and lid. Cinerary urns like this come from central Italy. Okay, sorry. Right. Sure. It is in a 95.
Oh, sounds better.
All right.
You can hear it.
All right, all right, all right.
Okay.
Is it good? Okay. Our next case study is this Etruscan terracotta cinerary urn and lid. These come from central Italy, and cinerary urns like this were designed to hold the ashes of the deceased and often decorated with reclining figures, like the man seen here, on the lid with mythological scenes on the urn itself. Sorry, okay. Here the popular Etruscan myth of a man battling with a plow is shown. And you can see that the reclining figure too is holding an offering bowl, although it's unfortunately broken. The urn and the lid do not appear to belong to each other, and they may have been paired while in the market given their relatively similar sizes and their probable shared origins in workshops of the Hellenistic period. And the Getty bought them as part of a massive acquisition of antiquities, around 400 antiquities in 1971, in preparation for the opening of the Getty Villa. They came with no provenance information or prior sale documentation, and there was no record of them ever having been published. This isn't really unusual for minor art objects of this type, and given the time period of the sale, but it makes reconstructing their histories very challenging. So we talked earlier about the amount of time provenance research takes, but we should also stress that provenance isn't always linear. Sometimes it just takes reading 200 auction catalogs, and sometimes it just takes luck. Thanks to a little bit of both, I was actually able to discover that a local gallery in Los Angeles, the Stendhal Gallery, had acquired both the urn and the lid from an Italian museum, the Museo Luigi Pirini in Rome, in 1960, as part of the dispersal and exchange of the historic Evangelista Gorga collection. Gorga was a famous opera singer who had owned 10 apartments that he filled with antiquities, artworks, and musical instruments around the turn of the 20th century, a view from which you see on the left. And you can see how jam-packed and crammed with objects this is. His collection was sent to museums around Italy by the state, including to the one in Rome. And next, that museum actually traded material to museums and galleries around the world in exchange for all kinds of ethnographic objects. Proving this would have been a challenge, if not for a remarkable footnote. And for those of you who do research, you know how important the footnotes are. You should always read the footnotes, which sent me in the direction of the publication on the right, which includes photographs of the urn and lid taken while they were in storage on the Palatine Hill in Rome earlier in the 20th century. But even knowing that the cinerary urn had come from Italy to Los Angeles in 1960 left a large gap. Where had they been in the meantime? Who owned them? So sometimes provenance is about teamwork as much as it is about luck. A colleague at another museum sent me the ad on the right when she heard I was interested in the department store sale of antiquities. And poof, a very familiar silhouette popped up. And so you can actually see the urn and the lid nestled among the big Greek vase on the right. A chance conversation on Twitter had led me to one of the stranger twists in the urn's life. A road trip through May Company department stores in America in 1965 to 1966 as part of a display, exhibition, and sale of ancient Mediterranean art, which is how our cinerary urn ended up in Pittsburgh. Far from being unpublished and unprovenanced, the urn and the lid had formed part of an unusual collection in Rome before they appeared in newspapers and in front of audiences across America. And they'd been on display in numerous exhibitions for thousands of visitors, even before they came to the Getty. We still don't know every detail, but I'm excited to have pulled together a little more of their history. So on the left, you can see the known provenance of these objects before 2015, and on the right, as it is today, with decades of history and display added.
Turning to our last case study, we're going to revisit our mosaic shortly. Oh, yes. Good. Excellent. Yes. I'll touch on the mosaic when it's on the screen, but in addition to discovering lost provenances, as Judith and I have just discussed, this project has allowed us to dig deeper and fill in gaps of provenances where digitized resources have become newly available. For example, in 2014, which is now many years ago, the Met digitized the Brummer gallery records. These are the archives of Joseph and Ernest Brummer, major art dealers in the early 20th century. A great many objects now in American museums passed through their galleries in Paris or New York. You can see them here, and these are the archives webpage, landing page, where you can kind of search different records that are all interlinked. One of the objects was the Getty's Orpheus mosaic, the one we've seen earlier. And just a bit on this mosaic, yes, is it displaying properly? Anyway, what you can see here is the central emblema, and it would have originally decorated a much larger room, about 12 by 8 feet, and probably a dining room or reception hall. But it has been, as mosaics often are, from the early 20th century, it was cut up for excavation. So this is just the central piece of a much larger floor mosaic, and it shows Orpheus in the center, surrounded by different animals, alluding to the story of Orpheus calming and taming the animals with his music. So, Orpheus mosaic, found in southern France. Where was I? Yes, and although we already knew much of its early history, because we had documentation of its excavation in 1899, and we also knew that it was sold in 1941 from William Randolph Hearst to the Brummers. So we knew 1899, 1941. However, we didn't know where it was in between those dates. There's this large gap of 2 world wars, and how did it get from Paris or France to New York? And yes, and the digitized archives, searching here, we were able to find its original record number and its original catalog card, and it revealed, in fact, that it was the Brummers who had originally sold this mosaic to Hearst. So they were the ones who, in 1928, had imported it from France, selling it to Hearst, and Hearst sold it back to them. And the catalog card also included where the Brummers had acquired it from. So we were able to retrace all this history. And also, this catalog card shows the mosaic shortly after excavation, and you can see here the emblema surrounded by more parts of that floor. Interestingly, the mosaic was also installed in the ranch house. It was one of Getty's prized acquisitions for his Roman room. And one of the most exciting things about provenance research is you never know what you might find. Sure, with this archive, we'd hope to fill in some of these gaps and better understand the different players involved in its history and its movement. But one of the records that we came across, and this credit goes to Judith for finding the number and tracking it in their tagging system, was this plan. And if you look closely, there's like squares and lines, and this immediately struck a chord because it looks like an excavation plan. We knew of an excavation plan from the original excavation discussion, but there was no plan reproduced in those publications, and more recent surveys of this site had said the plan was lost. This appears to be a drawing of the original plan, but it includes annotations that match up, and we're able to firmly identify this as the plan because it's also connected with the landowner of the site. And even better, the rediscovery of this drawing gave us a critical basis for further research. We were able to connect our mosaic, which we knew was with these other mosaics discovered at the same villa, but now we could see how they worked in a spatial context. And these mosaics are now housed in Vienne, which is south of Lyon, just south of Lyon, so if you're in southern France. Two of them are in Vienne, and the one on the bottom right is in the British Museum, but now they can be reunited with their original floor plan. And it is, of course, also worth mentioning that all of this research fed directly into the Getty's 2015 exhibition on Roman mosaics and the accompanying digital catalog, or digital and print, which includes links to the Bremer archive. And I don't know if any of you saw the exhibition when it was at the villa, but it did a great discussion of these excavations, both of this site and other site, and a lot of this research was so well timed with those Bremer gallery records being digitized. Sorry? Oh yes, and this catalog, the Roman Mosaics catalog, is freely available online, connected to our collection pages with great images both of the plan and other mosaics, high res, all good stuff. And just to show, we're, again, revisiting back our initial slide, we have our provenance beautifully filled out. The links are all hyperlinked to other objects with those same people associated. And the catalog information would be in our bibliography tab. And again, this is where the most up-to-date spot where any new discoveries, if more Bremer archive material is released, we'd be able to update this accordingly. And yeah.
So where else does this research go? What do we do with all this research? You've just seen what this information looks like in our collections database and our collection pages, but we also think it's important to share our work more broadly. And so you can read many more provenance stories without interference from the mask on the Getty's blog, the Iris, in the Getty Research Journal, and lots of other publications.
And it also feeds its way, as Nicole mentioned, with the mosaics into our displays. And some of you may know we reinstalled the whole villa between 2015 and 2018. Maybe I should ask, have any of you been able to see the villa since our reinstallation? Good, a few hands. We've been open post-COVID, so we welcome you. And you'll see up on the left, this is a view of one of the new galleries, which we dedicated specifically to the history of collecting in order to at least touch on some of these stories. And you see a sampling of sculpture and other objects from renowned collectors on display, which allows for us to focus on these object histories. One other project we're now working on, now that we've done this sort of first pass through the collection, is publishing a book with Getty Publications in which we are seeking to, I suppose, document our process, our methods, recognizing that many colleagues are also engaged in this kind of research and hoping to make this methodology accessible and available for everyone else. We hope we've done something of that as well today. This has been our first public outing, as it were, post-COVID, and so on behalf of all three of us, I'm incredibly grateful to Weston and all of St Matthew's for this very generous invitation, and I look forward to any further comments and discussion. Thank you.
I think first we want to thank you. We're happy to be your launch, but this has just been so fascinating. So David, for some reason, your wand behind the mask is not working very well, so you need to pull yours out. Thank you, all of you, for your patience with the sound challenges, because they are considerable. I know Weston wants to take this for just 1 second. Is there any, okay, I'm just gonna hand this over to you. Do you want to stay down here on the floor?
Yeah, I was going to lead into questions. Okay, I am a master, or I've been said to be, a master of the obvious. And so my question is, since many of the people seated here will want to scoot off to the Getty Villa, where will they find the Orpheus mosaic on view?
Oh dear. When this, so the Orpheus mosaic was proudly displayed in that exhibition, which ran for over a year. Unfortunately, with the reinstall of the galleries, it's no longer on view. So, but we do have other amazing mosaics with similarly fascinating provenance stories on view. Notably, our mosaic of Dares and Entellus has a similar Bremer-Hearst connection and LA connection. That one is on view. It's a boxer mosaic, or it shows two boxers, sorry. But yeah, the Orpheus mosaic, we have limited space, wall space. Mosaics are quite large, so this one isn't on view currently.
In at any point online, you can go into the very minute details of Tesserae, and you can explore its entire history on the collection pages.
Are there other questions? I think I'm just going to pass that. Okay, Stephen, I'll come back to you. I'm going to get to back here first.
Yes, how does the determination of authenticity intersect, or is that a subset of what you do? How does it relate?
Oh, that's such a big question. I would say that authenticity relates to provenance. So when we have objects that are grounded, right, when they come from excavations like the mosaic we've just been exploring, you know, that tells us much more about their context and their creation. I would also say that, you know, we have objects in the collection that were acquired as like grand tour gems, and knowing their histories is also important. We also work with our conservators to better understand the complete histories of our objects. So one of the stories that you can actually read on the Getty Iris is the story of a bronze cat. It's a cat with many lives. It was acquired by Getty on behalf of the museum at Sphinx in London, and it's one of those Egyptian bronze figurines. And for decades, it had been relegated to storage with a description of being an imitation. And so I was in storage and I was examining it to work on its provenance. And I noticed that on the base, there was an inscription by a restorer who was saying, I mounted this cat in London in, I think, 1892. And I said, that's very interesting. We had no records that this had happened. I didn't know why it was in London then. And I had some questions about sort of what the cat looked like, sort of the surface of the cat, the way its repairs functioned. And so I talked to one of our conservators, and our conservators ran a battery of tests. And they were actually able to use a special technique that looks at the last firing date of clay. It's called thermoluminescence testing, and that actually, there's still a little bit of clay material inside the cat from when it was the bronze was cast, and they were able to determine that clay material had an ancient date. So the cat is in fact this ancient Egyptian piece, and by using sort of both provenance and conservation together, we were able to much better understand its history, even if we still have a lot more to explore. I hope that answered your question.
And I'd add to that, our project was very much focused just on what is the provenance and what can we verify. And the Getty, you may not know, has in its history collected fakes intentionally as study pieces to know what was happening on the market, to know how to identify fakes. So we have some of those in our collection that we've researched the provenance for. but it's a good question to ask because they do intersect. But for our purposes, we're not assessing the authenticity. If we find something in its provenance that might imply that this could have been a gem carved as an imitation and not an ancient, then of course we discuss with the curators and figure out that history. So they do intersect, but our job is to just what happened.
And actually, to that point too, there's a wonderful article on the Iris by our colleague Ken LePatin, who recently actually he used archival sources and ledgers to better reattribute what we thought was an ancient gem, the Nios gem, we can actually discover sort of the records of the man who carved it and sort of its history. So you can go online and look that up too. It's a very fascinating archival tale.
And you'll get 3 different answers from us. Maybe not for every question, but if my mic is working, one other sort of addendum to that is, many of our objects have been in circulation for decades, if not centuries. And so not only is there distinguishing between, ancient, authentic and fake, but there's a lot of gray area in between. And many of these objects have gone through different stages of restoration, of treatment. Large marble sculptures often will have additions from the 17th or 18th centuries, and that itself is a tool that we've used as a way to determine history. If there is a clear sign of, say, something I've worked on is the restoration of ancient Greek vases, and identifying pigments that restorers would have used that were only invented in the 1870s provides you with a terminus that at least gives you at least a fragment of that history. So there's a lot of facets to that question.
Concerning the point in time at which you determine that the chain of title has been interrupted by a theft, is there any point in history that you would determine to disregard the theft and rely on the chain of title from that point in time? And the second part of that, I guess, is it not the case that most everything was at one time improperly removed from its situs?
I'll answer the second question first, or only just as a footnote on one of the objects we highlighted, which is true for other objects in the collection. Things that were excavated under the laws at the time that were allowed to be sold could be sold. That mosaic was on someone's property, the landowner decided to sell it. In that case, the British Museum liked the one they got, they passed on ours, and then it went to the Bremers. So there are contexts where antiquities enter the market through from excavation. And
and I suppose, and building off on that, we are coming into this project in the 2010s and having to navigate centuries of the way, as you point out, the ways in which objects have been acquired. And Weston's example at the outset, even within the Getty, there have been changes in policy. I suppose we take take a targeted approach in terms of documenting what we can know and what we can verify, the information that we can research. What happens with that? We say make it available, and it provides the basis for further research should that be needed. So it's on a case by case basis.
Can you tell us what the most extensive provenance was? I mean, how many 100 years back or how many different places an object resided before it came to you?
There are a lot of centuries-old explorations. Some of you might be familiar with the Mazarin Venus, which has been on view at the villa for a long time. The Mazarin Venus is almost certainly illustrated in etchings in Rome in the early 1500s. And we have a couple of other objects where we have kind of these drawings, and we have to use artworks and how artists are citing figures from antiquity in their art as kind of our sources. I think kind of the 1500s is our earliest period, and then the Mazarin Venus passes into collections in Paris. There's still a gap we're trying to understand, and she's at auction in the 1800s before moving to England in the Cook collection.
The Mazarin Venus will be on display in our forthcoming Rubens exhibition, which opens on November the 4th, which looks at Rubens and his engagement with the ancient Mediterranean. A shameless plug, but why not?
Yeah, and just to add, Mazarin Venus is something that continues to elude in filling in the gaps that Judith mentioned. Even just during the pandemic, we found some new or newly digitized newspapers and auction materials documenting one of its iterations, one of its sale in the late 1700s, and that was really exciting. Even you could talk more on this, but not now necessarily, but just to say, in this case, the Mazarin Venus is how many pounds? It's a huge object. They moved around a lot, especially as the house that was occupied, that was in for many years, was sold, and the contents moved. So it's, yeah, that one has it'd be great to have the map of that one's journey.
Any other questions? Here.
I guess that begs the question, if you don't find a provenance, what do you do then?
There's always a provenance. There's always, at least we know, one owner. I think what we've learned is to be patient, and that as new resources, and especially because other colleagues now, more and more of this work is happening, and there is more chance of connection. Things that Judith and Nicole have, sources that we might not have thought about before, like, fashion magazines and dealer advertisements. There are all sorts of strategies that we can implement, and so even if we find what seems to be a dead end, it's a case of marking that and then returning to it in the future.
And on that, as a footnote, we also have, for cases where we think we know what might have happened, but we're still trying to finalize it or really get the evidence solid, we have a space on the collection pages to give that explanation. So to kind of give context for what we know we don't know. But you're right. In the cases where we only know that previous owner, it would be like those bronzes where we have donated, and that's the one line. That said, we're still working through things and hoping to fill in the gaps. Yeah.
Our job is really, we described the first pass of the collection, but our role is to research. It's to assemble and to verify the information that we can. There are lots of other people who are involved with the collection's care and collections management, and those, a lot of those discussions happen, throughout the museum and throughout different roles.
Maybe one last question before we wrap up. I think if it's okay, I'm going to just take this one up here. Yeah.
I remember the Aphrodite story in 2008, and then I didn't keep following it. And so I'm curious, because you mentioned the photographic evidence that came to light, if there were ramifications for the person that had illegally excavated the piece. And does research lead to that, to the people, who had wrongfully excavated it?
Well, the story of the Aphrodite and other, that was the result of investigations in Italy led by the Carabinieri and others, and there were a number of legal cases against specific traffickers and dealers.
Yeah. That answers my question. Thanks.
Okay. Well, I think it's probably a good time to kind of wrap things up. So at this point, I just want to thank again our wonderful speakers. You can. What's so wonderful about what you've shared today is not only that it's a fascinating topic, but to see how it fascinates you all, it is. It's like this great detective treasure hunt thing going on, and it's just fascinating. I also want to thank Weston for your invitation of these wonderful people. And to all of you Saints Alive folks, just stay tuned. We'll have another program the first week in November, and if I was really on top of my game, I'd tell you what day that is, but don't worry. You'll hear it from the Carillon and our other channels. So if we can just do one more round of applause, and I think we're going to call it a day.